So as you know now, I'm moving towards the challenging scenarios that Mike and Eric have set us up for. And specifically, we're going to look to identify and manage the PBL scenarios that give us a lot of grief. And so it's interesting because we're talking about group learning, we're talking about the social learning theory, and there's just so much complexity to that. So the question is always, how do we kind of subdivide things? But I think in many ways this is actually fairly intuitive. The idea of really some of our challenging scenarios are really going to come from learners, a learner or a group of learners, so individually and as part of the group, and then some of them are really going to come from some dissonance about our role. How do we fit in, and what are our challenges? And sometimes that can actually feel very lonely. So we're going to divide them up that way. And so this is really, it's probably not a reassuring infographic, but really what it does, I think, it's just the snapshot of the complexity that we deal with problem-based learning, small group learning, that in just a snapshot in time, let alone over a 3-hour tutorial, week after week, teaching a course, how much complexity there is, how much is going through people's mind, and how we have to sort of be cognizant of the complexity that exists in this environment. And that's probably why there are often so many challenges. So the first piece is, when I first started tutoring, about the second or third time, I would just start noticing the second or third tutorial sort of personalities. So this is the student or two who are really going to be quite talkative and quite dominant, and this student leans into humor, and this student seems to be a bit introverted. And I remember sort of thinking that through and say, okay, I think there's nothing wrong with kind of having that initial sort of assessment, but really leaning into why am I noticing that? How is that impacting me, if at all? And just trying to kind of gain some insight into what I'm bringing in when I'm looking at people. And also, how does this actually affect the group? How does this affect group dynamics and group process for this particular tutorial in this particular course? And there's no doubt a lot of us have learned about, the matching of learning styles and teaching styles and all of that sort of piece in med ed. But I think this idea of learning style and approach is actually quite important, because what you'll often notice in tutorials, even small group tutorials with 6 to 8, is really that often you'll sort of see these dyads form on two sides of a spectrum. So you'll have one or two students who are really detail oriented, who are interested in the mechanism of disease, and basically the future internists, I used to think to myself, but the ones who really kind of going into that nitty gritty piece. And then people more like myself who might be kind of higher level and kind of big picture, and you'll sort of see that happening. And similarly, some who really lean into the biomedical model. Sometimes this is because of actually previous training. And others who, and it's not always students from non-traditional backgrounds, sometimes it's other students, but who might feel much more comfortable in a clinical space or discussing other elements of a case, like social determinants of health specifically. And, I think the first question is, does this improve or does this undermine the group? And that's an important question to ask ourselves, because ultimately, there's no doubt that group dynamics will alter a learner's approach. So even for ourselves, if we're having a conversation with colleagues and someone's really kind of going into a lot of minutia, that whilst it's important, may kind of, in our view, leave a certain element or perspective out. Someone who feels quite comfortable in the minutia may actually change the conversation a little bit. And I think that we have to just kind of be cognizant that group dynamics will alter a learner's approach if there's a vacuum or there's a dynamic that occurs. And so while you want to encourage individuals themselves to stretch and to take on new roles, I think we have to be aware that a group is really greater than the sum of its parts. It's a very dynamic sort of thing. Now, those are sort of things to keep in the back of our mind, but there are some dysfunctional behaviors. And so these are behaviors that affect learning, how knowledge is acquired, affect the safety of the group, and then again, how the acquisition of knowledge, and really can affect cognitive load of the individual and group members. And so there's lots of examples of this. I've just listed 3. So the rabbit hole, this happens to everybody, that sometimes you just, I think Jocelyn in our last group sort of said, you're talking and thinking at the same time. You don't really have a game plan. And so sometimes you can go down to a rabbit hole. But when you see this happening a fair bit, there is an impact on the group's learning. And sometimes it actually can reflect a certain insecurity in the group, and also the inability of the group to regulate itself. And so that's something to be aware of. Obviously, there's the disinterested student, or the student who's interested in what they're interested in. but really not sort of seeing that wedge. And how does that impact the group, again, is the question, right? Probably not in a good way. And then finally, there's the overt disrespect or unprofessional behaviors. And so these are all things I think that are dysfunctional. It's very common to in this red box to have some form of, do we need to know this? That's really legitimate, right? There's just so much to know. Students are in problem-based learning, if it's an academic sort of piece, maybe kind of at the beginning stages of their career, and they're really trying to reconcile, how much do we need to know? That's quite different than the other statement, which is, I will never need to know this. And this for me is a big red flag. First of all, I don't love in group learning, and the prognostication seems to me to be a little bit premature, and nevers, like absolutes, are always. And I mean, I'm being somewhat facetious, but this is actually something that a couple of times has led to some problems. So I really want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind if you hear that or sense that. So how do we cope with this? The biggest thing, I think, is to not ignore these behaviors, right? They just tend to become more entrenched. They're harder to address, not just for that particular problem-based learning group, but it doesn't do them a service moving forward. And so practically speaking, for sure, I think that these things should be addressed in the group whenever possible. So we do have the mechanism of check-in and check-out. Check-in can be a little more social sometimes, and we'll talk about that. And check-out can be a place that's actually quite intentional, where you can ask students, and you can actually ask them to do their own assessment, like, what were your individual contributions? How did that affect, in your view, content for the group and group process? And then you can have sort of a couple of peers weigh in, and then finally yourself. And that's helpful, because really want to encourage that reflection as individuals, and the ability to kind of give feedback for colleagues. And so this gives us a lot of information. First of all, it gives us insight into the learner. That's important. Like, do they have insight? Also, if there's a convergence of opinion, that's quite different than when there's a divergence of opinion. And when there's a divergence of opinion, I mean, at least yourself, that can be something to lean into, and it can be a springboard for some conversation. And then finally, the receipt of the feedback is quite important as well, right? And I think the most important part about checkout, or about using this tool, is really that it has to be iterative. You just have to iteratively have this sort of piece. And that's actually the most fair way and the best way for the group to kind of keep coming back to process, individual and group, keep coming back to content contributions, see what the progression is for the learner and also for the group. And is there an ability to reset in any way? And of course, that does not mean that there is not a place to add individual feedback and even escalation. But certainly I think within the group, whenever possible, is what I would recommend. So tutor challenges. So, this is funny, because when I actually first started teaching, I remember thinking, well, okay, I've done MF5 and then now I'll do MF2. And now I ask myself this question about what is my role, not each MF, within each tutorial. Forget about the MF, forget about the medical foundation or the course or the subunit. Each tutorial, within a tutorial, I actually ask myself this a fair bit, because we require a lot of dynamicism and flexibility in our role. And so a couple of tutor challenges. So I think a common one is how much to give away, because you kind of got the answers in this tutor guide, theoretically, and the students know it. It's kind of interesting. So what do you do when students are stuck? When they just can't move forward in a conversation and they're spiraling a bit? Or when there's objective setting and there's just one objective and you can tell, like, they're just not going to get there. Or they've set objectives previously, they're now at the place of take up, and they haven't done the work. They just haven't been able to cover that. And so a few tips, I think, is first ask yourself, is it you that needs to supply the information? Because frankly, you're sick of it. You're uncomfortable with the pauses and this process. Like, what is actually sort of normal process of discovery? Or is it actually the group that needs intervention? And then if it's the latter, then as much as we can, we want to help them get there, right? So not to supply, but to prompt for information, not to explain, but to probe for understanding. And then finally, the concept of parking lot is quite common when people kind of are going off on a bit of a tangent. I always tell students, it's not that what you're saying isn't important. It's just that, with respect to the timing, it is important. And so why don't we parking lot it, either as a mini objective or something that people can look up. But parking lot can also be utilized when students have set tutorial objectives and they just haven't either they kind of miss something, or sometimes they just don't do the work actually once in a while. And so we just don't want to let them get away with that necessarily. We want to say, okay, you know what? This is something that we were supposed to cover. I know it's a mini objective like genetics or whatever is not maybe interesting to you. No criticism to the geneticists, but it seems to often be genetics with my groups. So we do need to get to this. So why don't we just set it for next time? And so there is an accountability piece, right? And another common challenge is, do I need to be a content expert, and how much do I talk? You can tell for me, I enjoy talking. So this is something I ask myself a lot. It's actually very important. And so it's natural for students to turn to us for answers and anecdotes, and they often actually do enjoy, particularly if you have some content expertise, clinical pearls, right? And so there is a little bit of flattery or something that I think feels kind of good to be able to contribute. But really, how does that fit into problem-based learning? And so I would say, for sure, self-disclosure and having a social presence is important, right? I think both Mike and Eric spoke about this, that, if students feel that, you have their interest, there's benevolence, there's integrity, you're someone who's trustworthy and on their side, for sure, it improves knowledge acquisition. And so that piece is important, and that can be part of check-in. With respect to how we kind of share our information, I would say if we think about sort of the construction of knowledge, and scaffolding, maybe to lean into some narratives that, again, kind of make sense contextually. So always ensure the context, and this is going to help them kind of build their own schema. And then always check in with the group, because the group will often let you know, again, depending on the safety and so on, if you're talking too much. And I think we need to be kind of really intentional when we ask for that feedback. Like today, I noticed I actually held myself back a fair bit, because the last time I thought I spoke too much, and I noticed we almost ran over. So this is how I'm feeling. Can I get some feedback? Really interested in how this looks like, and then take the feedback, obviously. And so my last slide is really just about avoiding pitfalls. And I would say the main thing when we're thinking through a challenging scenario, what feels challenging to us, particularly because students at the beginning will often say things are going well, is really go back to group dynamics and process as your key indicator, right? So check our biases, because we've all taught before and had students before and been students before. Be very present because of how incredibly complex these interactions are. And do not avoid conflict, because it's not going to go anywhere, and it doesn't do the student any benefit, and it doesn't make us better faculty. And avoid fixing the problem yourself, because your solution is probably the wrong one. And so really, feedback and resolution should be a responsibility of the group writ large, I think, is probably the most important piece. And the other point is that, we're always in a process of learning. We do have our medical director, for example, in medicine, we do have sort of folks that we can go to. And I think with every faculty, there's maybe a community of practice or a tutor coaching program, just others that we can go to say, I'm running into this, would love some feedback in terms of how I might approach that.